Oh, hello. Hi. Hi, hi. Come in. Come in. Come in. I'm just going to. I was about to pull off a book from the shelf here, which actually I'm really particularly pleased to show you. Um, Poetry that was all along that shelf, of course, is spilling along here as well. Mostly slim volumes of modern poetry, but you already saw I had the Yeats. I read a Yeats to you a while back. Well, very properly and proudly, right next to Yeats, we've got Seamus Heaney. We've also got Micheál O'Siadhail, another great Irish poet. I've got all the individual Heaney volumes, but this is when he. Let's take this out. I'm particularly pleased with this. This is when he gathered together a main collection, poems 1966 to 1996, and it was actually given to me, this particular hardback volume, even though I had all the individual books. Of course, they didn't know that. But my parish that I was leaving in Huntingdon gave it to me before I went off to be a chaplain in Cambridge. But there are other things about this volume that I want to show you. So why was I wanting to pull the Heaney volume down? Well, it's a very peculiar thing. It's just a word association suddenly sent me to a poem, and then I realised we've had great excitement here because, of course, we've had the first vaccination has actually happened, and it happens that the first person to be vaccinated was a woman originally from Northern Ireland called Margaret Keenan, and I thought, I know, what's it about Keenan? And then I suddenly thought, Keenan's well, Rosie Keenan, and I suddenly remembered that there was a wonderful Seamus Heaney poem, a poem of deep insight and consolation, which mentioned a lady whose name was Keenan, and it's called At the Wellhead. And so I thought, oh, I'll just read it again for pleasure. And it's amazing how I'd always remembered that it was a poem in two parts. You can see it here at the Wellhead. It starts there. But of course, I looked at it again. I said, of course, it's two sonnets. And I'm now persuaded that it was perhaps intended to be one sonnet, and then the last part of one sort of drew on the next. At the Wellhead, it's called. It's a very important poem of Heaney's, I think, and an important image. For Heaney, he's got another poem we might have time for, which begins, as a child they could not keep me from wells. He loves wells and water sources and rivers, and his muse is something about welling up and flowing and the transformative effect of rivers and streams. So when he writes a poem that's actually called At the Wellhead, you know that he's going to take you in some sense to an important source. But the poem, as I say, consists of two sonnets, is really tributes to two other people, the way somebody else's presence and music can influence you. And again, I'm deeply lamenting the loss of my dear friend Rob Groves from my band, and there's a line in this poem that I think is going to be important for me and maybe important when I speak at his funeral. But anyway, let's hear the poem in itself, in both its parts. It's just called At the Wellhead. Your songs, when you sing them with your two eyes closed, as you always do, are like a local road we've known every turn of in the past, that midge-veiled, high-hedged side road where you stood looking and listening until a car would come and go and leave you lonelier than you had been to begin with. So, sing on, dear shut-eyed one, dear far-voiced veteran, sing yourself to where the singing comes from. Ardent and cut off, like our blind neighbour who played the piano all day in her bedroom. Her notes came out to us like hoisted water ravelling off a bucket at the wellhead, where, next thing, we'd be listening, hushed and awkward. And then part two of the poem. That blind from birth, sweet-voiced, withdrawn musician was like a silver vein in heavy clay, night water glittering in the light of day, but also just our neighbour, Rosie Keenan, she touched our cheeks. She let us touch her braille in books like books wallpaper patterns came in. Her hands were active and her eyes were full of open darkness and a watery shine. She knew us by our voices. She'd say she saw whoever or whatever. Being with her was intimate and helpful, like a cure you didn't notice happening. When I read a poem with Keenan's well in it, she said, "I can see the sky at the bottom of it now." I found that, I love that poem. I will think about my friend Rob with the tribute to the singer here. So sing on, dear shut-eyed one, dear far-voiced veteran. And then this great line, sing yourself to where the singing comes from. I think everyone who's a musician or a poet knows that what they do and the song they sing, the poem they write is coming from somewhere deeper than themselves, that there's a source, and you long to be in that place where all the poetry is, in that place, if you're a musician, where all the music is. And there's a wonderful line by the poet John Donne, where he's dying in London, and he writes what he thinks, in fact he lived on, but he thought might be his last poem to God, and he said, "Since I am coming to that holy room, with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music. I tune my instrument here at the door." It's a wonderful idea that life is tuning up for a great concert, but you won't simply play God's music, you'll be God's music. That God in some sense is the place where the singing comes from. And of course the image of the well and of the water in the well is in both halves of this poem. And that lovely, lovely thing, her notes came to us like hoisted water ravelling off a bucket at a wellhead. And again, being with her was intimate and helpful, like a cure you didn't notice happening. And then this final thing where himself, Heaney, feeling as though he's as a source, reads an earlier poem, probably the poem Personal Helicon, which has a well that has reflections. And this blind from birth woman says to Heaney, after hearing his poem, "I can see the sky at the bottom of it now." And the sighted poet, in a sense, gives sight to the blind woman, and yet the blind woman shows the poet again what his poetry is and how it works. Seems fairly extraordinary. Anyway, all that was prompted simply by the mention of Keenan, but I haven't shown you the most important thing, well, the most precious thing about this book. I had an amazing experience in 2002 where I not only got to meet Heaney, but to help with a friend to interview him, and he came early and I bought him a pint and we ended up having quite a long chat, and then when he even asked me about myself and what I was doing, and then at the end I, nudged by my friend, I shyly put my book forward for him to sign, and he not only signed it, look, he wrote this: "To Malcolm, with high regard, walk on air against your better judgment, Seamus Heaney, 4/11, 2002. I can't tell you, I didn't look at it until I got home, and then I found out what he'd written in the book, and it was so moving. And luckily after that I got to meet him a few times afterwards, and in the end to invite him to come to Little Gidding, and we had a wonderful day together there. But that's another story. Thanks for dropping round.